All right. So, welcome to Beyond the Bones. I'm Dr. Peter DeNoble, orthopedic surgeon, and your host. I am honored today to have Dr. Selene Parekh with me, who is a world-renowned foot and ankle orthopedist, and he has done a lot. I wrote down some notes just to make sure I don't miss, we may spend the rest of the podcast basically talking about his credentials, but he's new to New Jersey, but he is well known all over the world. Just started a practice last year, a little further south in Princeton area. But he is a pioneer, a foot and ankle pioneer, done a lot of work in that space, and we'll talk about some of that stuff, but spent a lot of time down in North Carolina, UNC, Duke, and has published over 100 publications, has over 10 patents in the foot and ankle space. So it's really a privilege that we have him here today to discuss some of this stuff. And that's just like the basic stuff that he's done. All the other things that we can talk about go on and on. So we'll have to pick the hot topics before, otherwise we'll have you here all day. But welcome. Thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
All right, so
I'm looking forward to this. It should be fun.
This is it's really an honor, and I think we first met. It was a few years ago, pre-pandemic,
Right.
at the New Jersey Orthopedic Society, and really kind of I learned a lot from the stuff that you talked about. You gave a number of talks. One was on your total talus, the 3D printing thing, which is really cool, and love to get an update on that, and also some of the 3D printing bone reconstructions where you are taking essentially segmental defects, like missing chunks of bone, and you're creating essentially cages that are like specific to their bone using contralateral. I think it was contralateral CT scans. Exactly. So, that's some of the stuff that I'd love to hear a little bit more about. But why don't you sort of give us maybe update us on where you are in that space first? And
well, I think the 3D printing space has been is still in its infancy, but I think it's come dramatically forward over the last 5 to 7 years. Okay. I think within orthopedics, there have been really some hot spots where 3D printing really found a need and a niche, and has proven its technology and its worth. And I think we are seeing it percolate now throughout orthopedics. Mm-hmm. One of those niches not only was orthopedic oncology, where you're doing big limb salvage cases or big bony resections, but also foot and ankle. And like you alluded to, some of our early applications were with a total talus replacement, where we're replacing the entire bone in the center of the ankle, to some of these patients who came in and had bone loss either from trauma, from an infection, or even sometimes from osteosarcoma or something like that, mm-hmm. and trying to figure out ways that we could salvage their limbs. And that's really where we had our early applications, trying to salvage limbs in areas where you had big bony losses from some of these other applications. And as we started using the cages and realizing that the cages worked and the bone really grew into the cages, we then started looking at ways to put articulation around it. And that's how the taluses came about. And we started really going down that path.
That's really interesting. We have a lot of more, traditional ways, be it like the mascale. It's very much more, but this is a lot more like, as opposed to just bone grafting or taking a free fibula and just sticking it into a tibia, which is a totally different bone size, caliber, strength, and stuff like that. Now you're talking about essentially just almost regenerating, in a sense, or letting your body regenerate around a scaffolding that is essentially replacing that exact sort of size of a bone.
For sure. And I think there's multiple benefits. One, just like you said, we're regenerating around a scaffold. That's great. That scaffold is actually very strong right from the day you implant it. So
strength at time zero.
Strength at time zero is amazing, and you don't get the resorption that you get later on, right? So we've taken these cages, put them on the street, and driven our SUVs all across them, and the scaffold, you visually look at it, it's maintained, right?
Yeah.
So that's pretty amazing. The other thing that, talking about mascale, that's multiple surgeries.
Yeah,
if
sure.
you talk about limb lengthening, right, for bone defects, that is not only maybe multiple surgeries, but in today's day and age, when we're so aware of mental health, those are very debilitating to a patient from a mental health perspective, right? You have these big external fixators on for months, up to a year.
Yeah.
Can't weight bear right away. Can have fraught with multiple complications. The frame wires can break, bend, infected. I mean, that's all gone, right? It is dramatically different. And the nice thing is, if the cage has failed, you still have those techniques.
Right.
And ultimately, I know this scares a lot of people, but a below-knee amputation is still an option, right? Last option, and not a bad option,
Right.
but certainly always there as well.
Right. Those are always the bailouts that you have, and so you have the ability to sort of try, but like really advance the field with some really good options that still exist if needed.
Yeah.
And similarly in a lot of the hand and wrist space, that's sort of the way it goes. That's why we've been able to experiment so much with scapholunate, reconstructions for so many years, because, does this work? I don't know. Proximal row. Like your bailout's always right there.
Right.
And we're always trying to get better at the things that we think work, but we know we can improve on. And,
Right.
So that's really cool. And the total talus, I mean, you must be like one of the only guys, right, surgeons around the world, frankly, doing this work.
So since we started doing this about 8 years ago, certainly the technology is much more accessible throughout the world. Lots of surgeons have started doing more of it. But yes, I personally have over 150 of these and growing. I mean, we have patients coming in from all over the world. And it's, not just your simple total taluses anymore. Now we're adding fusions underneath it or in front of it, like the subtalar fusion, talar-navicular fusion, doing it with a total ankle, doing total navicular fusions with the total talus, where we're replacing the entire navicular and the talus. So it's kind of become iterative as well and changed along the way.
Right. Once you replace one thing and it works, and you can realize you can start to build out. Because a lot of times if you got a talus problem, there's other problems that you have to address too.
Yeah, absolutely.
So that's great. And listen, these are patients that are who can't walk properly, right? I mean, that's like your ability to just move about in the world is like limited. So you're really giving people amazing relief, amazing, recovery.
Well, it's the technology, right? I mean, I'm just implementing it, but it's the ability to give patients some quality of life back. I mean, I have a firefighter who's back on the force, patients who've won the senior games for their state, patients who, I don't encourage them to do impact activities, but are running and jumping on their total taluses and total ankles. I mean, patients who are playing 18 holes of golf multiple times a week. I mean, and then just simply walking with, I don't tell them no pain, but 0 to 3 out of 10 pain, where they lived at 7, 8, 9, 10.
Yeah.
It's dramatically different.
It's a big difference. I mean, every step you take having that much pain, I mean, that's just that, to your point about mental health, I mean, that really takes a toll and really probably puts you in some very
Dark
places.
Yeah.
Right. So, no, that's really good. I mean, look, I think a lot of what I do is important and helpful to people, but, when it's your lower extremity, like ankle, knee, hip, and not being able to just walk, and really you see those patients do great. That's why I think hip replacements, knee replacements, people are so grateful. But this is the same idea. They still have to take a step. It's still a joint as part of that.
Yeah, and then the 3D printing is just revolutionizing everything. Like for you guys, for total shoulders, where there's glenoid loss, and you don't really have any off-the-shelf options. Well, now 3D printing is helping to reconstitute the glenoid or reconstitute the distal humerus or the proximal ulna to do some really complicated elbow stuff. It is percolating now throughout all of orthopedics and really giving us options for difficult problems we had before.
Right, and there's always that subset, right, of like patients who have just really complex bone loss issues, joint or partial joint loss, and your options are so limited. They're so primitive still. Be it, fusions, like shoulder fusion, elbow fusion. I mean, those are joints that are supposed to move a lot. And, if you fuse them or even have something that's not working, that's somewhat painful, it's just so dysfunctional. So this really kind of is a paradigm shift, I feel like, in the orthopedic space, and it's continuing to get better.
Yeah.
When
Well, I mean, we talked about, obviously off camera, we talked about the holy grail is being able to print cells, right? So what's happening right now is metals being printed. The next thing's happening is peak products and peak-like products being printed, and it is evolving, and people are looking into being able to 3D print bone and cartilage. And to me, that's the most exciting thing. I mean, imagine a day where we no longer have to give you a metal hip or knee replacement, but I'm giving you bone and cartilage back.
right,
I mean, I'm hoping that happens in during my career.
it'll happen. The question is when.
But when?
When will
But
it happen?
it's going to happen.
You see these technologies emerging in parallel, and at some point they intersect, right? When it comes to tissue engineering and 3D printing, right? So right now they're still kind of on parallel tracks, but
Yeah.
at some point there will be an intersection, I think.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that goes for all of medicine, right? Would be it, solid visceral organs and things like that too, right? We've seen them, do the ear, right? And then the skin. So it's only a matter of time. It's just, when will it be? When will all these smart people help us out,
Right.
implement it? And we have a lot of smart people in our field, which is great. One of the other things, you're very involved with, certainly a lot of research. You've done a lot of work. Talk to me about patents. You have 10 patents.
Right.
That's a field I don't think a lot of us are too familiar with. I've kind of learned a little bit about it, but I have 0 patents to my name. My wife has 1 actually, but talk to me about that process and how that came about and what goes into that.
So, innovation has been something since when I went to get my MBA. I happened to go to a program, Boston University's healthcare entrepreneurship program, and the head of the entrepreneurial center for the business school was a former general surgeon. So it's kind of interesting, right? Business school, the head of entrepreneurship for business is a general surgeon. And so I got the bug having a mentor who was already an innovator, and he was already in his 70s, but he had been an innovator. And then during my rotations in medical school, I happened to be on my urology service on a service that was also a surgeon innovator. And then in research from undergrad and medical school, I was around Henry Mencken. I don't know if I'm sure you know. Henry Mencken was an innovator, right?
Yeah.
And so I happened to be around innovators, and I didn't recognize at the time, but that really pushed the limits of what was accepted standard practices, not in a harmful way, but they were thinking out of the box. And so I got the bug, and in medical school, started thinking innovation, residency, same thing. And then the consequence of that is when you start thinking about devices and implants, you start looking at what's patentable and what's out there and what's not, and how do you protect your ideas. And early on, I probably gave a bunch of ideas away because I didn't really understand the process. And then you realize, wait, you need to protect the process, you protect your ideas, and you put patents around things. And initially, they were implant patents. Now there's also some technique patents that are starting to file as well. And it's just a mind shift of how we think about things. I mean, you probably do it all the time, too. You're in the operating room frustrated about something. You think of an idea.
Right.
But you never think, okay, should I patent this or not?
Right.
And I think once you start thinking that way, you start looking at different things that you do, maybe second nature, that can be protected.
Right. And what's interesting about patents is it's sort of like you can have diagrams that support it and stuff, but my understanding is that it's the language, it's literally the words of the patent that are actually the idea.
Claims.
The claims, right.
Yeah.
So, and that's right. And it's a multi-year process sometimes when you submit it to hear back from the patent. I mean, it's a government agency. It's working slowly for the most part, and they're going through their diligence, the diligence of the process. But that's really good. Do you find that you've moved a lot of these ideas to a point where you either want to sell them or do you want to license them? What do you do with the patent when you have it?
I think it depends on the patent. Sometimes you collaborate with industry. Sometimes if you have a big enough patent and you have the energy and the network, maybe you want to develop your own company around it. I know some people have just licensed it out, and they get a royalty for every time that product or that idea is used in an implant. So I think you have options. For busy surgeons, I think most of us don't have the time to necessarily put together a company per se, right? But we'll license it out to a currently up and running company or do a royalty agreement.
Yeah, I mean, I learned a little bit about this from Jorge Orbe, right? Who's famously the volar plate and now has Skill Dynamics, and he gave a great talk to us a few years ago about his process and what he went through. And one of the interesting parts about this, and you, I'm sure are well aware, but I learned is that, like, to your point about having ideas, if you share, I think we're all get excited about our ideas, but if you share your idea, even with anyone, that's no longer your protected idea. Like, you really can't tell anyone. He even said, he'd have people come up because he's an innovator, and people get excited about being around him and sharing ideas that they have to see what he thinks about it.
Right.
But the second he goes, I don't want to hear your idea, because the second you tell someone else about it, especially someone who's in the space, who's an innovator themselves, that's no longer, it gets in your head. Now all of a sudden that idea can be used, and ideas are ideas. So, like, you really have to protect it, and you have to be somewhat secretive about it.
Yeah, you do.
And write it down and go through a particular process.
So
right?
this is where you learn, right? If you want to go to, say you have an idea and you want to shop it around the industry, you have to learn standard operating procedures. So there are companies out there who will tell you, share your ideas with us first, and if we like it, then we'll sign a non-disclosure. Well, now you just did it in reverse, and now there's nothing to sign, right?
Yeah.
So you have to learn along the way and say, okay, if I got an idea, first of all, you want to put it on paper. A cheap man's way of doing a provisional patent is just to seal it in an envelope, mail it to yourself so that you have U.S. Postal Service date and time on it,
Okay.
and you never open that up, right? And if there's ever a question, you have that letter saying, this is when my idea was born. You could also do a provisional, a little bit more expensive. You could do a full patent, which is even more expensive. But you want to at least somehow protect it first before you start saying, let me shop it around. And before you shop it around, you want to have non-disclosure in place so that you are protected.
Okay. Those are great tips. And, for any future innovators out there or current innovators that want to make sure their ideas are protected. So that's really cool. Are any of your patents around the total talus, or?
Yeah, so I actually have a patent with total talus,
Okay.
and then some around some of the subtalar fusion and fusion ingrowth surfaces that we're developing as well.
Okay. That's interesting too, because I was, we'll talk about, I won't even talk to you about it.
All right.
Because it could be a patent.
That's right. There you go.
But we'll talk about that later. But, some of the other stuff, I mean, you're involved in so many things, but one thing that I wanted to talk to you about, one of the things that you mentioned was about entrepreneurship. And I do want to just comment on that, because I do feel like in the healthcare space as doctors these days, I feel like entrepreneurship is sort of either, discouraged or it's not rewarded, right? It's in a lot of ways, we're kind of the worker bees, right? We're supposed to be more conforming and be sort of running more or less a conveyor belt of services.
Right.
And if you have ideas and you have thoughts outside of the box, it can sometimes almost be detrimental to your survival within a box or within the system.
Sure.
I find. And but as an entrepreneur yourself, I think you just switch practices. Correct. And I think that it's you can talk about it, but I feel like you have to really have a lot of passion for doing that, because you could be I feel like discouraged. You certainly aren't going to be encouraged to be an innovator as a doctor in our system. So you really have to basically take on these pet projects and really move into that space to become who you are, so that you can then, when you join, whether it's a hospital system or a big group, you can be it. I think you mentioned maybe carving out certain elements of your career and your interests so that they're not controlled or contained by the system, the box, so to speak.
So, I think if you look historically, at least when I look at the surgical career over history, surgeons were innovators. They still are, right? We're in the trenches. We know what the problems are. We get frustrated with lack of solutions, and you come up with ideas. And thankfully, a lot of what we have to do is not benchtop research and basic science, right? We're looking at applications of techniques, instruments, implants in the operating room. So that the development cycle is very quick. And I think, to your point, healthcare has changed because it's more about streamlining. It's a business. You can't have a lot of time to be doing things out of the box. So how do you live in both of those things? So I think it's a challenge, and every person figures out how much of each box they want to live in, right? I think that's the first thing. The second thing is, I think if any part of you wants to live in the innovation box, you have to figure out, in whatever practice model you're in, is it encouraged, discouraged, and how much of it do you keep, right?
Right.
Because that's an important part. And if I think that models that take it all away really discourage innovation, right? Because why would you spend your sweat, your equity, your time away from other things that you love, when, not to say financials is everything you want, but you don't get rewarded for that time that you spent.
Right.
So I think you have to look at those contracts. You have to figure out ways that you can do carve-outs. You have to figure out ways that you can maybe have it separated, and that's not always possible. So each person has to figure out what works for them.
Yeah, it's such an important thing. Even if you don't think you're going to be an innovator, if you have some ideas or you tend to be a creative person, I mean, that's one of the, I think, the big things within healthcare now. We talk about burnout, moral injury, things like that. And so much of it, I believe, comes back to the stifling of creativity among really intelligent people who otherwise are creative and maybe find outlets and, you know, hobbies and photography and various other things. But at the end of the day, that same brain is in a space that, you know, demands creativity in a lot of ways. And if you're not able to even, you know, expand on that in ways that you believe you could improve the discipline that you spend all your time developing your expertise in, I just think that that's that could be, you know, really one of the major sources, I believe, of where I think doctors get burned out, to be quite honest with you.
Absolutely.
But, you know, look, I think that it's about, you do have to fight for that for yourself, because nobody's looking out for you as a doctor, as an individual.
No, I always tell all my trainees, my fellows, that, to your point, if you even think at some point that you're creative enough that you may develop something in the future, you may not have an idea now, but if you think that might be something you may want to do, before you sign that first job, before you sign that first contract, you have to address that issue. Mm-hmm. Because what will happen otherwise is that will be the fissure between you and your practice. Mm-hmm. And that fissure grows if you're a creative person and you feel stifled.
Right. And I think that maybe it's becoming more of a focus now for trainees coming out, where, you know, they're getting the benefit of other people's failures or where they've had problems. But I do think that we're so tunnel visioned as coming out of training, right? We're so focused. We have to be, frankly,
right?
Just because there's so much to learn, especially now. There's so much more we know, but you got to jam that into your head to start practicing your specialty. Yeah. But there is so much more that we learn on the business side. Yeah. Zero training for, right? We didn't go to business school. You did, but I didn't. I learned it all in my garage and, you know, kind of on the streets. But
it's changed even more, right? Because think about social media and the internet now.
True.
Physicians are not just in their offices in the hospital. I mean, look at you're doing a podcast. We are online, available 24/7, not live, but through content we generate. So just like the athletes with name, image, and likeness, your name, image, and likeness now is out there, right? Doing things.
True.
So
it's a brand.
Who controls a brand? Right? So all of this plays in, and we are in uncharted ground that is evolving and developing. But to your point, the younger generation, they're doing it more than even you or I are. We have a presence, but ours is probably small in comparison to some of those younger physicians who have hundreds of thousands of followers already now for content they're generating.
Right, that's a good point.
Who owns that? Who's capitalizing on that? These are all questions that practices or in hospitals are going to have to figure out.
Well, that's interesting, right? Because I find I get very demoralized thinking sometimes about the plight of physicians, and I know it's not traditionally we're not as sympathetic figures, but I think we're getting there to the point where there's a lot of doctors leaving the field. There's certainly a shortage of certainly good physicians, but just physicians in general, surgeons in general, but still the highest the most precious commodity in healthcare are patients.
Right.
And followings and having trust among a following of patients. And to your point, like a lot of residents coming out have, tens of thousands of followers on social media. That's an instant potential patient base.
Correct.
So I have not been there. I never had social media until I was well into my career and sort of developed it late. But I would encourage anyone coming out of training now who has developed a brand, a following, a name for themselves, that is a brand, and you should probably think about carving that out of any potential contract that you go into, because that could be a big potential issue. I don't know of any, conflict or litigation around that, but I could see that happening.
Yeah, so could I.
I agree.
Absolutely. So it'll be interesting how this all plays out.
Yeah, we are definitely in uncharted water. But speaking of social media, you have a pretty cool platform that you've developed over the last few years, the Fantasy Docs.
Yep.
Right. And why don't you just talk a little bit about that?
So fantasy sports, everybody knows, it's a growing field. A lot of sports betting happens, but fantasy sports, even before the sports betting was legal, was huge and growing. Mm-hmm. It's not just fantasy football. It's fantasy cricket and baseball and basketball. I mean, it's everything. It's a $3 billion industry and growing. And so about a decade ago, it was during the World Cup. The U.S. was in. One of their athletes got hurt, and it was an ankle sprain. But all this incorrect information came out from the team, coaches, all this stuff.
Yep.
And it just frustrated me. So I started blogging on it. Started getting all these people following, commenting, and I just continued to blog on different injuries as time went on. Nothing formal, just as time went on. The problem is when you want to do a real blog, it's like writing a scientific paper. It takes time. Mm-hmm. And as a busy orthopedic surgeon, we don't have a lot of time. So the format flipped to video blogging, vlogging, once phones caught up to speed on cameras. And then one of my now partners in the Fantasy Doctors reached out to me, who's big in the fantasy world, said, love what you're doing. I'm following this. How about we start a company around it? And boom, that's how the Fantasy Doctors formed. So we now have about 20 people who work full-time, part-time with us, anywhere from sports med docs to neurosurgeons to athletic trainers, medical students, undergrads. I mean, we've got everybody working with us, and we just pick up injuries and we talk about within minutes of the injury, put out content on video analysis, likely injury, likely return to play, and then we also look at analytics. We started doing some of our own AI and machine learning to look at these injuries to figure out when our ideal return to play times and even your performance when you come back. Yeah,
well, that's interesting because there's such a premium now. We were talking about a little bit earlier about, the gambling. There's a lot of money, and there was, I think, a lot of times fantasy sports kind of blended into the gambling world. But now with all the legalized sports gambling in a lot of different states, I just feel like it's saturating even just the mainstream telecast. You hear about that, but one thing that's oftentimes missing is intelligent commentary about return to play and even just return to play at certain levels and how that could affect the potential performance of your fantasy team.
Absolutely. And it's not just that athlete, but if that athlete's the quarterback or the running back or the marquee player on the team, then it's the whole offense. And so it just got this trickle down effect. So our guys are really good about understanding that and trying to, explain it to our fan base.
Do you have guys who are on call watching games? Like you're on
this
call
guy.
tonight. Do you have to be ready to go?
My partners and I, who do a lot of the content generation, my partner this last year's been doing a lot of it. As you said, with my change of job, but we're 24/7. Something happens, somebody gets hurt. Our spotters who work with us will be like, "Hey, this happened," and boom, we're on, and within minutes we're recording.
That's and we were talking about this a while ago, but part of it is just getting it out there, because it doesn't have to be perfect. It doesn't have to be super polished. It just needs to get out, and you've gotten very good at, getting it out smoothly, succinctly. And of course you know exactly what you're talking about, but, sometimes, I think we do get caught up in this sort of Instagram era of like making things look right and look good. But that can be a handicap to, getting things moving and getting information out there.
Correct. Yeah, I think timeliness for what we do is very important. So you're exactly right. It may not be the most polished, but it's about the content. The videography of it is secondary, not very much far behind, but it's really about the content. And that's changed too over time. We've gotten really good about integrating the videography part of it and the photography and different images flowing in and out of but it takes time to get to that.
Yeah, it's amazing. Like, ideas are so, they're plentiful, and there's a lot of great ideas that seem so simple. Like, oh, yeah, let's create a company and let's start talking about injuries. But there's so much that goes into any idea that you don't realize. It's to build it up into something that's really valuable is a lot of work. So I appreciate that as someone who's admiring your entrepreneurship in that. And I also notice, along the lines of social media, I think, is it your sons who have a podcast?
They have their podcast.
So talk to me about that.
So their podcast is ranked in the top 5% of podcasts in the world now.
Wow.
They are two teenagers now. Now they're 16 and 14, but at the start of COVID, so, January shutdowns happened. My kids, I have 3, but my 2 boys, who are the oldest 2, had been sports enthusiasts since they were yay tall. And middle of the night, one night, they're bantering about something. It was like 1 a.m. My wife was tired of hearing them shouting in the middle of the night. So she goes in the room and it's like, listen, if you're going to argue, just start your own podcast. And boom, that laid the seed. And by March or April of COVID, the first year of 2020, they launched their podcast. And they've been doing it every week since then. They released their podcast. And they've had NFL, NBA, MLB, Olympians, coaches, famous sportscasters on there. I mean,
wow.
they interview guests as well.
Wow.
So they also do the kind of the Mike and Mike thing where there's hot topics and they'll banter back and forth.
Yeah.
But they'll also do interviews. And so they're podcasters in their own right and building it.
They're just straight up podcasters. I mean, these guys are the real deal. I mean, it goes to a couple things that I take away from that. Is that one, it goes to show you that, like, if you're passionate about something, you can really put together a great thing. But 2, that goes along with that is being consistent, right? Because that's something I find in this day and age, we tend to maybe as a society be a little bit more, we're on to this and then we're on to that. And then I lost interest in this and we drop it and we move on to that. And to be able to be at their ages, be consistent every week to do a podcast. How many years have they been doing it?
3 years.
3 years, every week. So, I don't know, what's the math on that? Over almost 200 podcasts?
Maybe over 200 podcasts, over 50,000 downloads now. Wow. And growing. And it's called Two Brothers in Their Sports.
Yeah.
And they love it. They're passionate about it, to your point, right? You find something you love, you just put the hard work in. And just do it. I
admire that, and I think other kids should admire that, because that's something that their role models, even though they are kids still. Right. That's really cool. So, kudos for raising great kids and having your wife inspiring them to start a podcast. It's very productive.
Yeah, well, it seems to be working out so far.
Yeah. So that's really cool. So, and one other thing I wanted to talk to you about was your certificate program in AI, because that's a big deal, right? AI, ChatGPT in the last 6 months or so has been, now it's a thing. Like, it's a quick paradigm shift. Now all of a sudden we're worried about the end of the world coming soon with, but what did you learn, and what's your opinion on that?
So for me, I've always loved technology, implementing it in the operating room, just learning about it, following it. It's kind of the passion that what I read about. And one of the things, not only with the fantasy doctors, we have all this data that we're collecting on athletes. Machine learning is important, and trying to figure out ways that you can connect dots that you and I can't synthesize,
right? But
that the algorithms can synthesize, and then having the algorithms learn themselves. This is something that I've seen coming for a long time. And so I wanted to do a deeper dive into machine learning and artificial intelligence, and then obviously ChatGPT happened, and it changed everything. And a lot of people think it's a fad. Personally, I don't think it's a fad. I think it's going to change our workflows. It's already changed my workflows. It is something that's a phenomenal tool, and I think this concept of artificial intelligence will change the way we deliver care. I think it's going to change the way patients consume content. I think it'll change the way they get content that's reliable. It'll help us be more productive. You may not need as many people to do certain things, particularly, maybe not in medicine, but even in medicine, like in the back offices, you may not need as many people to do certain things. Maybe there's a world where an AI does your authorizations for you, right? For the MRI and the CTs and all that stuff. It's coming.
Probably, I'm going to imagine, I'm going to go out on a limb here, probably not too much of a limb, but I'm sure the insurance companies are using it to deny stuff.
Absolutely.
At this point.
Of course.
It doesn't seem like, some of these things are like, is this a person?
Right.
It doesn't even look like, it looks like machine writing, and it doesn't even make sense. So, it's a primitive AI, but it's being used against us in that instance. We should be using it as a tool. If we don't embrace it and use it as a tool, we're just, we're handicapping ourselves when it comes to how we as physicians engage in healthcare. So, especially as in private practice, or even as independent doctors, or just doctors in practices in general, how do we leverage that?
We're already, at least for foot and ankle, starting to delve into that and looking at ways that ChatGPT, Bard, and Bing are providing content to patients,
right?
And looking at that. So we're going to start publishing on those kind of things too.
So that's interesting too, because a lot of what we have learned over the last 5-10 years about how we serve ads to people through Google, and that's sort of been the platform without a lot of change in the last bit of time now, like 5 to 10 years, like I said. And it's been pretty reliable. That's where people are getting their information. I think we all think about Googling. It's a verb.
Right.
But, now it's like, at what point will that shift come in where you don't type it into Google anymore? Maybe you type it into Bard, but or ChatGPT, and it's like, best, tell me who the best foot and ankle surgeon is.
I wanted to basically just say, Jarvis, tell me what blah, 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 blah is, like Iron Man used to do. I can't wait to be able to say Jarvis.
Yeah, exactly. It's going to be whoever you want it to be.
Right.
You can customize that.
But that's what's going to happen, right? So you're exactly right. If you type in, tell me, what are the best prostheses for an ankle replacement? As a patient, you get reams and reams of results from Google. What do you even know what to read?
It's hard to know.
How do you even know? So if there's something that can aggregate and hopefully meaningfully aggregate in an honest way, hopefully, and it's one voice, then it's almost like talking to somebody and just asking them, hey, what's the best total ankle replacement out there? Or who's the best person for my elbow surgery?
Yeah, what do you think the best total ankle replacement is and why? And they'll give you, and you can keep diving into it. You can even ask follow-up questions.
Conversation.
Right? And it'll tell you. I guess this will probably come in future, but I feel like ChatGPT, the problem is with ChatGPT that currently, and in my limited use of it, but, is you ask it stuff and then it comes up with something that looks really solid. And if you don't have the background information to understand, oh, that's right, spot on, amazing, I can't believe it said that. And then, wait a minute, that's completely wrong.
Yeah, it hallucinates.
It's and it's confident about everything.
Right.
It doesn't say like, I'm not quite sure, it doesn't put like confidence intervals.
No.
It's just, that's what it is. And so I worry a little bit about the general public consuming information in that way, because it's just sometimes just lying to us.
But it's coming, right? So that's the thing. Like, how do you figure out when it's hallucinating and making stuff up versus it's real information? I don't know if you've done it, but I've done it. I've looked myself up on ChatGPT and
no,
Bing.
I haven't done that. It's a good point.
Do it. It's made some stuff up. I'm like, that's not me. That I didn't do that, but it's made some stuff up.
Wow.
Right. But a lot of it's spot on. Like goes back to my high school.
Wow.
Which
really?
I don't even know where that content came from. Like it's
somewhere deep in the web.
Somewhere deep in the web.
When did you go to high school?
I graduated in 1991. Went to West Orange High School up in North Jersey.
I mean, that was like the infancy of the internet. So somewhere along the way, that information got in there.
Right, but the fact that it found it and integrated it and realized that that's the same person, it's kind of interesting. But then it hallucinates too.
What did it make up about you?
I can't remember. Something about some women's league or something. A, I'm not female, but B, I some kind of award with a woman. I don't really remember because it's been so long. But and then every time you look yourself up, you get a little bit of a different variation. So it's not always the exact same thing, which is interesting too.
I wonder what generates variation in something. You're saying the same exact question generates variation in the answer?
Sometimes.
All right. Well, everyone's going to have to go, not Google themselves, but ChatGPT themselves. Is it GPT or GPT-4?
So GPT-4, my understanding, is not readily available. So you'd have to just do the version, which is 3 right now. But you can Bing yourself or you can Bard yourself. I mean, I don't know if those are verbs yet or not, but I'm using it as a verb.
Getting there, yeah. I think that they're all going to be verbs at this point. Wow. So that's something very interesting. And probably, when did you take the AI course?
2 years ago.
So that's probably outdated at this point.
It changes.
It's probably all
fast.
old information.
Yeah, exactly. It changes so quickly.
We probably all need a certificate in that at this point.
I mean, I think to be honest, I think it's part of something that should be part of a core curriculum as kids are growing up now, because it is going to be part of their life. Some of the schools are already teaching the kids, rightfully so, in my opinion, how to use the AI tools to be more productive, whereas other school systems around the country are banning it, which I think is wrong. I mean, I get why you'd want to ban it, but it's really a tool. How about you enable kids to use it the right way?
Yeah, you have to enable it, and you have to empower people to think critically. And this goes back, I think, to one of my big thoughts about where education needs to be now. We're in this age of abundance. Not only, I felt like that from a food standpoint, where we always have food around. Always, we end up having an epidemic of obesity. It's an age of abundance. We're in an age of abundance of information now, and so we're all getting fat on information. A lot of it's unhealthy,
right?
And we need to be able to more carefully select the information that we take in, or at least understand how to parse out information critically. And so critical thinking is, I think, one of the most important skills that's portable into the future, I find.
So I think that's important, but realize even from our end, it's not only for ourselves, but for every patient you're interacting with, right? I mean, you already have it. I have it already. Patients look things up on the internet, come in with all this information. Some of it's right, some of it's wrong. But imagine there's one source that they're getting it from, ChatGPT, Bing, whatever.
Right.
And they're taking that as gospel, and now you have to
unwind it.
So being able to understand what's out there and realize what content your patients are consuming, because that, at the end of the day, that affects you and the time that you spend with the patient and the education and their perception of the quality of care you're delivering. It also becomes, I'm sure you've already experienced it too, where they feel like it's right because they looked it up, and now you're saying something different, and now it's the opposing view.
It's conflicting, right?
Conflicting, right? So it's this conflict that it's just very complicated. And how we chart this path, it's an interesting time to the obesity of information.
Yeah. I mean, that's probably a great way. We just coined that. But I think that's exactly what it is that we have an unhealthy amount of information, but that's okay because it puts the onus back on us to more carefully and critically parse out what's real and what isn't. And it comes back to the point of like, ChatGPT it doesn't list its sources.
All right.
It just says what it says. And it's up to you to kind of now go do deep diving on that.
I don't know if you know, but you can ask it for its sources, but it'll make up sources.
It'll make up sources.
So
wonderful,
again, it'll
wonderful.
hallucinate.
So it's like a real person.
So,
it's like
yeah, exactly.
thinking it's receiving.
So it's not only asking us for sources, but sometimes they're not even real sources. So you don't know all the time. So that's the one shortcoming. It won't say, I don't know.
I think it's interesting. We've got this issue in society where we kind of there's this like recoiling back from like the elitists who are supposed to be the all-knowing, right? And we should just listen to what they say, and we kind of want to say no. We have an opinion too, and that's what I feel like the internet has kind of given a platform. A lot of social media has given platforms to people who weren't necessarily academics. They weren't Ivy League educated, but they have big followings now. But the drawback to that is that they don't have the depth of knowledge. They have charisma and they have influence, but they lack the expertise to more carefully curate. I mean, I was looking just as an example, I think there was a thing a few weeks ago with like RFK Jr. I don't know if you've been following this, but he's like running for president, and he's, Kennedy, and, he's a well-known, he got his start, I think, in environmental science. And I think a lot of what he talks about there is all the pollution and things, which I think is very valid. But then he kind of has moved into this world of the anti-vaxxers, where he's very vaccine skeptical. And I was listening to him on the Joe Rogan podcast. And I think, Rogan's kind of like he thinks a lot and a deep thinker, but he's not like an expert in these areas. So he's sort of at the mercy of the people that are delivering information to him. And so RFK is a charismatic guy. He's got he's a smart guy. He speaks well. He's a good politician, basically. And he actually was citing different sources. So I was like, and I started thinking, I'm like, well, this guy's smart. He's citing sources. I'm like, this is crazy. Maybe there's, I'm thinking. So then I went to one of the sources. And I read the study, one of these seminal studies about mercury in the vaccines, and what he was saying wasn't what was written. He was representing it wrong or incorrectly, just moving a little bit here and there to fit the narrative. And I realized and that was just one study I looked at that was, to me, felt like a very compelling argument. Yeah. If someone had done like a primate study, feeding them, the ethyl mercury versus the methyl mercury, and looking at levels in the brain, and it was totally misrepresented the way he was describing it, at least to my critical analysis of it. But I don't think most people wouldn't have gone and looked up the study on PubMed, downloaded the full text, read it.
Because who he is, he's deemed an expert, and then boom, you get all this misinformation.
Yeah. So it's an example of the independent investigation of truth is so important. We all have to the onus is on us to educate ourselves with the critical thinking tools to be able to say, I heard this, sounds right or sounds wrong, or I'm not sure, it's interesting. Let me do my own investigation and come up with an idea for myself, and not, because otherwise we start to become, I believe, sheep led by
of course,
who knows who the shepherd may be. So I feel like we're in that time frame. Through human history, this has always happened, but it's becoming more complex, I think. And I don't know, that's just sort of my feeling about it. But that's why I feel like, for my kids at least, I'm always trying to help them try to think critically or look deeper into, what they're telling me. I'm like, is that true? What do you mean by that? Like, what's your source?
Right. A lot of, at least I have teenage kids as well. So they'll see something on social media and they deem it truth because it's somebody they follow and they think is accurate, but that's not always the case, right? So you're exactly right. I mean, challenging the kids to teach them to learn more critically is important. And
there's a lot of really charismatic people out there saying things with a lot of confidence, which can be very misleading.
Right.
So that's one of the things that I notice, just because I'm, one of the things I feel like as a doctor in healthcare these days is that like we have a lot of ideas. We're very smart people who I mentioned, like I feel like we're in boxes running conveyor belts, getting burned out. We have a lot of ideas. We have a lot of thoughts. There's a lot of thought leaders that haven't put their thoughts out there. And I feel like the public deserves to hear from experts with thoughts. That's why, I spend the time to try to set this up to get really smart people on to share their thoughts and give them another platform to share. But there's a lot of people out there that, I feel like are consumers, but really should be contributors to the greater discussion.
Yeah, no. Well, I think that's where platforms like this make it more accessible. It's still in medicine, I think, I would venture to say, and I could be wrong, that the minority of physicians probably are active on social media still. There are some that are very active, but I still think it's the minority.
Yeah.
So to have other platforms aside from your academy meetings and your regional orthopedic meetings is important, I think, especially in today's day and age.
Well, I think, too, there is a certain degree of, there's that sort of stage fright that we all have just naturally, right?
Yeah.
Talking to groups. But what I find somewhat ironic is that, like, we train getting up, right, throughout residency and beyond, getting up in front of our peers who are probably the most critical of what we're saying. We get up there, we prepare, and we speak to the most critical people who, you should be the most anxious to talk to, but we feel the most comfortable doing that oftentimes. And then on the flip side, you feel like, I don't want to get on social media. I feel like a little nervous. Like,
sure.
What do you mean? You just gave a presentation at, to like a bunch of experts. Like,
right.
Yeah.
No, well, I think that's also ingrown, right? Through medical school, you're doing it through residency, so you're so used to it. And it's such a foreign thing still for social media. You don't even know who's consuming your content. And it's really the world that has access. So it's like just at such a different level.
Right. There's probably, you're right. I mean, I think there's a floor and a ceiling to the experts that are like our peers. Like there's only so much that, like you can defend your points, to the ceiling and to the floor. They're not going to be disrespectful to a certain extent.
Right.
Whereas when it's in the public, that's true. Every Joe Blow and their mother, maybe they'll start commenting on your eyebrow.
Absolutely.
There's a certain, you're right. So there may be.
And listen, from the fantasy doctors, we've learned that there's these trollers and they'll attack you.
Trolls, right.
And the trolls, and
Well, you're in sports. Now you're dealing with fanatics.
Well, exactly. So it gets even more passionate and more aggressive if they don't like what you're saying, right? So you have to almost have some thick skin, and you have to realize don't respond to everything. You just kind of put it out there, and that's it. You just let it be. You let it live.
A hater's got to hate, and if you don't have haters, what are you doing? Right?
Well, then you're not making a difference, right?
You're not making a difference. You're not making an impact. Well, on that note, let me let you run. And I really appreciate you joining us today. And
yeah, this is fun. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, we'll do it again sometime soon.
Awesome.
Thanks, man.
Cool. Appreciate it.
Right.